Welcome everyone, bienvenidas, bienvenidos to the book presentation of Community of Peace, Performing Geographies of Ecological Dignity in Colombia, with the author here, Christopher Cortain, which I hope I pronounced your name correctly. This event is organized by the Latin American and Caribbean Social Natures Working Group and co-sponsored by the Center for Latin American Studies. On behalf of CLAS, we're very excited to have you everyone here. We're thrilled to be hosting in-person events again, and we're looking forward to have you on our next one. The author is an assistant professor in the School of Public Services at Boise State University, a Latin American Studies graduate from UC Berkeley. He earned his PhD in geography at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. His main areas of research include geographies of peace and conflict, globalization and development, race and ethnicity, performance, and social movements. His work has appeared in journals such as Ethnic and Racial Studies, Journal of Peasant Studies, and Progress in Human Geography. I'm gonna dejar la palabra to Jesus Alejandro Garcia. He's a third-year PhD student in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. His PhD project uses a political ecology lens to analyze how multi-scale state territorial practices of water management are shaped by riverine populations, struggles for environmental justice in the Upper Magdalena River Basin, Colombia. His work combines elements from the humanities and social sciences to engage in conversation with academic fields such as critical agrarian studies, social studies of infrastructure, political ecology, of extractivism, and terraqueous geographies. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Janet. Well, I was planning on introducing Chris, but you've already done so. That's awesome. Thank you very much. So I'm only going to say something real quick. On behalf of the Critical Environmental Justice Lab and the Social Natures, Latin American and Caribbean Social Natures Working Group and the CLAS Center, would like to thank you all for being here. And I would like to also thank Professor Natalia Brizuela, the director of the center, for helping us with the space and the work she's doing here. I would like to thank you also Janet Bird, Vice Dean of the CLAS Center, for the support she's providing for this event, and Janet, who's made an amazing work in putting all this together. So thank you all for making this possible. Thank you for the work you're doing as well, Chris, and take it away.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much, especially to the Latin American and Caribbean Social Natures Working Group and to the Center for Latin American Studies for inviting me here. It's truly an honor. The best place to launch this book that just came out a few weeks ago, especially here at UC Berkeley, where I did my undergraduate work, and really being a Latin American Studies major launched me to be able to do community-based research and activism, and kind of prepared me to then join the Fellowship of Reconciliation, Solidarity Accompaniment Program in Colombia, which I'll talk about a little bit about later, to be able to do this kind of work. And then, here we are 15 years later, kind of the product of all these years of thinking with movements and with these particular communities in Colombia. So what I want to do is just do a really brief as I can, kind of context of the place we're talking about here, and kind of Colombia, the Colombian context for anyone who might not be familiar. And then I'm going to do a little bit of performance and share some stories and some quotes from the book and give some reflections and highlight some of the concepts that I find useful for thinking about these questions. So we're talking about a community, a rural farming community or campesino community in northwestern Colombia in the Urabá region, here near the Panamanian border. And this is one of the areas where kind of the last, this era of armed conflict in Colombia was very, very intense between different armed groups, the government forces, guerrilla forces, paramilitary forces, especially because of the strategic nature of this region, right? So like arms and drugs trafficking, lots of natural resources, fertile land, plentiful water that can be harnessed for hydroelectric power, small-scale crops that farmers grow in the hills, large-scale agribusiness, right? Also mineral reserves, right? So kind of these different economic and political actors competing to control these resources. And also kind of it's this moment in the 1990s when the war really intensified here, this moment of kind of capitalism expanding and needing new kind of resource frontiers, new materials, and kind of expanding, having the technology to do that, and moving into these new places, right? And so in this area, what we have is this classic kind of competition between these armed groups and kind of capitalist interests who are looking to harness the resources in this area, and a local campesino community is trying to defend its way of life, right? And this is a pattern that we've seen kind of in Colombia's history going back at least to 1850, when this model of export-oriented development for beef, sugarcane, coffee, chocolate, etc., kind of farmers moving and clearing the frontier, connecting areas to markets, and then entrepreneurs coming in to dispossess them of the land, make them either tenant laborers or just evict them altogether for the extraction and the production of the resources, right? And in this area, this community that had a long history of autonomy and community organization and a very strong economy there, allied with Colombian human rights organizations, came up with a strategy to declare itself a peace community. And what that meant was a series of commitments to not participate in the war and not collaborate with any of the armed groups. So not giving any supplies to the guerrillas or to the kind of the state or paramilitaries on the other side, denouncing human rights abuses, and also participating in community work. Now, in response, unsurprisingly, but tragically, the community was attacked by that, especially by the right-wing paramilitary groups in conjunction with the state armed forces. This is a massacre that occurred in 2000 in the village of La Unión, which was the kind of the first village that this community, after being all the way displaced back, forming itself this neutral strategy, and then trying to go back to the villages one by one, and then is massacred again by paramilitary forces in conjunction with the National Army. And again, back to kind of these interests, kind of these broader economic and class projects that this reflects. I'll just quote one of the peace community leaders who's kind of explaining kind of the understanding of the war and kind of its class-based capitalist nature, as well as kind of its racial content as well, who said that this whole war has an objective: free trade, to kill the people in the social organizations, to annihilate the indigenous communities and unions because we demand rights, to kill many in order to subjugate the rest, because they have to exploit the mines, gold, oil, water, and minerals. And as campesinos, we do not want to leave the land. For the government, they have to kill us. The story of so many years of war is due to this, to pave the way for enrichment and wealth. As campesinos, Afro-Colombians, and indigenous peoples, we do not need petroleum to live, according to our ancestral practices, but we are now obliged to because the United States and Europe need it. So again, we have this sense of kind of this class-race confrontation going on here between indigenous and African descendants, including these campesinos, and kind of these capitalist interests, right, and state interests. Now, in spite of that, the community has survived. Just last month celebrated its 25-year anniversary, and in these years has actually returned to a bunch of villages. And this is kind of a map of the state of where the community had expanded to as of about 2016. It's kind of changed a little bit since then, but kind of all these different villages, and even expanding kind of in this area where there's this large hydroelectric dam with campesinos there also joining the struggle. So I think kind of this standoff, a lot of community members talk about they had nowhere else to go. And you kind of ask them, like, why? Why did you organize in this way? Talking about not having anywhere to go. And I think that it's really emblematic of this moment we live in, of like intense crises, of climate change, of ecological degradation, of intense violence against women, against people of color, against different groups. And there's kind of like nowhere left to flee to. And I think the peace community is an example of a community that there's nowhere else to go, there's only resistance. But in that resistance is going to create something different and show kind of a different type of a world that we could live that's different from those kind of violent systems. So I'll leave it there, just kind of the context. I hope that helps. If anyone has any questions, we can come back to those later. But what I wanted to do now is come a little bit to perform a series of events that I experienced being there. And it'll kind of think about some of these questions of doing research in these areas and activism, this broader question of solidarity, especially for those of us who aren't in this kind of community, but what that might look like. So A few things, just acronyms that will come up in the performance. Obviously, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, or FOR, is the accompaniment team I was a part of. Members of FOR here as well with us today. So kind of their accompaniment team in San Jose, in the Peace community, and a team in Bogota. PBI refers to Peace Brigades International, another international accompaniment organization that accompanies the Peace community of San Jose. And AUC, a paramilitary organization that at the time was supposedly demobilized, but will come up in the performance. So this performance is called We Will Stay If. So after a day of writing reports and sharing meals with community members and playing with the kids and writing more reports, I was with my teammate in our office getting ready to shut off the computer and go to bed. It's Mario from the Regional United Nations office. Allo, soy Chris de For. A massacre in La Esperanza. No, we haven't heard of that. Where'd you hear this information from? Yeah, I mean, if there was a massacre there, people probably would displace down through this way, but we haven't seen anybody. All right, well, let us know if you hear any more information. All right. Let's see, who might we call there? Doña Oliva. Well, straight to voicemail. They don't have electricity there, so maybe they ran out of battery, maybe there's just not signal. Oh, PBI's calling. Allo, soy Cris. Yeah, we heard about a possible massacre in La Esperanza, but don't have any more information. Yeah, we tried calling somebody there, but we couldn't get through. Or if you hear anything else, let us know, and we'll do the same. All right, ciao. Well, at this point, kind of, it's night, everyone's gone to bed, so why don't we get some rest, and we'll see if we can get some more information in the morning. In the morning, we went to go seek out a community leader, Emilio. Hola, buenos días. Emilio, ¿qué tal? Hey, so we heard about a possible massacre in La Esperanza? Well, a massacre in La Esperanza? No, at least not yet. So what happened was a youth was coming back after going to the market, selling the crops. He was coming back towards La Esperanza, and the paramilitary stopped him in the trail and said that they're planning to take over all of La Esperanza, and that people had better get out while they still have the chance. They have a list of people that were getting ready to kill, and so the youth should deliver the message to the rest of the community. So once news arrived there, obviously people terrified, packed up a lot of their things, and just this morning we had people walking through here with their horses packed with, large pots and their children and as many animals as they could. But there's still a few Peace Community families who are there and are holding out. And so we're going to organize a commission to go and evaluate the situation, and we want you to accompany us. Okay, great. So we're going to have to do our security analysis and send our letters of notification to the embassies and the armed forces so that they know that we'll be in the area. Okay, but we got to go soon. Esos gringos demoran mucho. Bogota team? Yes, you sent the notification letters to the authorities? All right. That way the army and paramilitaries, they'll get the message that we'll be over there. All right, great. Talk to you later. Ciao. On the 4-hour walk from La Union to La Esperanza, my boots got stuck in the mud. We stopped to eat oranges that we found, growing along the way. And also at an abandoned Peace Community house, we saw AUC written onto it in charcoal. Emilio pointed out a fresh military boot print in the mud below. When we got to La Esperanza, Emilio called the community meeting. So you're the last people blocking the paramilitary from taking over this whole area. So what are you going to do? Are you going to displace like the others, or are you going to resist? We will resist. We will stay if we have permanent international accompaniment. All right, so FOR, can you stay for a few days? All right, great. We're also going to need FOR back in La Union, but we can bring in Peace Brigades International, PBI, and rotate. After hanging up our hammocks and sharing meals with Doña Oliva and her family, we sat down and talked with her. Rice and plantains and the food just all cultivated right here, so delicious. Thank you so much. So, how was it that you originally came to La Esperanza? I would say we came displaced. We were from a region from the south of here, and there wasn't a lot of land there, and the violence got really difficult there, and so we migrated here to the north, seeking new land. And when we got here, there was nothing. It was all jungle. And we planted maize, we planted beans, and then the violence arrived here too. The paramilitaries and the army attacking the guerrillas, but mostly killing the civilian population. And so we had to displace from here. But just last year, we returned as the peace community. And now that we had everything planted once again, we're being threatened. If it wasn't for the internationals, they would kill us all. The armed groups, they respect the internationals. Not willing to be displaced again. Not willing to be displaced again. Jesús Cristo, protéjanos, proteja nuestra familia. Jesús proteja nuestra familia. Thanks so much for everything. We'll see you in a few days, and PBI's on their way as well. Oh, look, there's PBI. Hey, so, did we see any armed actors on the trail? No, we didn't, but we did see AUC and a fresh military boot print written on an abandoned community house. How are the community members doing? Oof, well, they're scared, but they're also super courageous, and you're going to eat really well, too. A few months after this happened, maybe a month or so, I left the FOR team and came back to the United States and called back down to the team in La Union. Aló, soy Chris. How y'all doing? Yeah, and how's everything going in La Esperanza by chance? So the tensions kind of just diminished a little bit. And all those families who had originally left are now back there. Oh my gosh, just because those few families, it's like 10 people. Wow, that's amazing. Well, take care of yourselves and send my greetings to the community members. Tell them I miss them. Yeah. All right. So, just wanted to see if anyone has any kind of questions or comments about the performance or anything we've talked about thus far, and then I can kind of continue on with more things about the book. But if anyone wants to, if there's any thoughts, we can kind of pause for any comments, questions. Yeah.
How did you feel leaving La Esperanza after being there for a few days and knowing what kind of risk they were in?
Yeah. I mean, it's intense. I mean, I think what was really amazing about those moments was kind of there were different organizations there, and knowing that, PBI was on their way, or, that you weren't, like they weren't being totally left alone. But there's a really intense kind of emotional aspect of all this work, and I think that kind of your question gets to that of feeling like you're leaving somewhere, and what that means for those people who say that the reason we can continue to stay here is because there's this international presence, right? There's a lot of emotional weight, kind of from our side as well, kind of with those circumstances. And I think that there's also something I think kind of those coming and going for me over all those years, like always wanting to go back and kind of prioritizing that being super important, you know, so that it's, you kind of leave at certain moments, but there's a continuation of the solidarity. Any other questions? Yeah, maybe one more, Michael.
Sure. This is great. Thank you. I wonder if you can give me any more insight into the community. Right? It's sort of a whole, and of course, as the state kind of galvanizes sort of trust and coming together. But I'm wondering if there's some unevenness in that community about what to do. Should we resist? Should we sell goods to them? Should we leave? You know, and how does that get resolved in particular moments, if you can?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a great point. So one thing to remember too is, and I get more into kind of the peace community itself, is that like they're not the only actor in this area, and there are other campesinos who are not part of the community, you know, don't follow those commitments that the peace community has to not collaborate or every Thursday participate in the community workday and things like that. And so there's definitely different, you know, strategies that people have and different perspectives they have with respect to a mining project or building of a highway through this area, and kind of those struggles are happening as we speak. I think within the peace community, there's also, you know, differences of views on certain topics, and those get played out through time. But I'm always struck by how united they are in spite of disagreements. And I think there's actually a quote in here about that. One of their leaders, Berta Tuberkia, talks about kind of seeing that the only way of survival is having that collectivity and that organization, and kind of in spite of some disagreements, always trying to come back together. And I think one of the things too, we can maybe talk more about this later, I wasn't going to go over it much here, but kind of the importance of their commemorations. Kind of we saw the painting of commemorating the massacres and the way that they go back to those places and do those performance with stones and with pilgrimages. That also is a key part of kind of maintaining people's commitment. As they say, kind of memory is the strength of the resistance. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a really big factor there. So yeah, so for me, I kind of just wanted to do that performance a little bit, setting up, you know, the kind of subtitle of my book about performing geographies. And so, you know, I'm drawing on this methodology called critical and performance ethnography, and it has kind of different aspects. But one is just, you know, when we do this kind of community-based research, it's really intense. Like, we have really intense experiences, and it's often hard to depict those realities, right, and kind of show them. And so performance as a, you know, theatrical performance is one way to do that and kind of bring those emotions and do it in a more engaged way. And think about how to do that in the text as well. So I try to do that, but you know, there's a limit to the textual word. It does certain things and doesn't others. But also kind of performance as an analytical lens too. As an accompanier, like, we were really aware of how we were seen by armed groups and the community as this, like, you know, this representatives of the international human rights community. And as researchers, we have the same things where we are seen and interpreted as standing on certain sides by the different actors in these situations, right? And so I kind of think this understanding of like the way we play certain roles is really useful in our research, right? And this performance, kind of to use the concept of Dwight Conquergood, it's always a dialogue, right? It's always a dialogue. There's like, just with here, right? Like me being a performer and the audience, like their meaning is created through that interaction between the two. And the same thing happens between solidarity activists from the US interacting with a community in resistance in Colombia, or a researcher in a community, right? There's always kind of that dialogue and the production of meaning. And I think thinking about that way is useful to be strategic about those actions. And for me, you know, the intensity of that experience as an accompanier is really what prompted me to continue to analyze the significance of this community and contribute in my own way to what they call the justice of history. In terms of, those of you familiar with Colombian politics, right? I mean, the impunity is just rampant. Like, there's hardly anyone held accountable for any of these. But the community talks about the importance of, there is a justice of history and leaving a record. And by having that memory, there is kind of a justice and dignity through that. And so this is kind of my contribution to trying to contribute to that memory project. So a little bit kind of just overview of the book real quick. So the first part kind of thinks about the kind of a political analysis of the peace community, how this kind of autonomous, civilian-based movement kind of diverged from electoral politics and also left insurgency, armed struggle, and then also bringing an analysis of kind of the racial dimensions here, which we don't often think about in terms of campesino movements, but thinking about kind of the racialization that's at play here as well and how that relates with indigenous and black communities. So it's kind of part one. Part two, I situate this within the recent peace process in Colombia, the peace accord between the Colombian government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, and think about the debates around what does peace mean, how are different actors in Colombia defining that, and how does the peace community define peace as they name themselves with that way. And then part three, I go into a little bit how the peace community practice this peace. So through the commemorations, through a series of different practices they have, and I'm going to kind of move to a few of those here. So one thing that they've done is have these food sovereignty programs, and one is to create agricultural centers. And here you see kind of in the top left, there's this sign saying private property, free of mega projects and mineral exploration. And I think this is a really key part of the peace community, is this rejection of extractivism. And peace community leader Berta Tuberquia talks about it this way, kind of why they're doing that. She says, "We are not doing exploration or exploitation of mines. The land, I compare it with the body of the human being. If we strip it of minerals, we are stripping it of life. Like the indigenous people say, Mother Earth." So again, there's kind of this sense of the land being a living being and the importance of seeing ourselves in interrelation with it, right? And then all these projects here, so for example, this is panela, raw condensed sugarcane, dried, staple of Colombian diet, and the peace community beginning to cultivate it themselves and produce it within the community. And a little bit describing the process, here's kind of the food sovereignty pioneer of the peace community, Javier Sanchez, talking about the process. He says, "Making our own panela gives me so much happiness. There have been many difficulties. People said that, no, that is very difficult. You won't make honey or panela. But some older men told me, yes, it will work. I worked with cane when I was a kid. And we began. Indigenous people came here to show us how to make panela. The first batch was a failure. Many people, you have to show them that yes, things are possible. That they see because they don't believe. I won't use that, no way. And the people are now happy, making their own panela. It has a good flavor." So I think here, you know, this question of, one, the solidarity of communities, exchanging ideas, teaching one another how to do these techniques, and also just the importance of these kind of visionaries in these communities, that in spite of the kind of the collectivity, it depends on people having a vision, and also that this importance of saying that things don't have to be the way that they've always been. We can create a different world. And also that a different world already exists in these practices here. So Javier Sanchez, the person I just mentioned and quoted, he's actually gone as far amongst a few other families in the community to try to create totally self-sufficient farms that can kind of sustain all the things within that area that they need. So a couple things from his farm, kind of a thatch house using kind of growing the plant there and then harvesting it right there to create the roof of the house. And then this is a plant bore, which is fed to the fishes, right, in a fish pond there. It kind of just shows like after being fed to the fishes and before. And I think this really is an amazing depiction of this idea of sustainability, or kind of what I'm calling in this book, drawing from a lot of these communities in Latin America, talking about dignity as a key kind of lexicon and keyword. And thinking about that environmentally is kind of like there's an ecological dignity here, right, in terms of the way different species interact with one another towards mutual well-being rather than exploitation of land or exploitation of other human beings or the earth. And so another kind of practice of the peace communities do these large caravans or pilgrimages. And this was a case in 2013 where kind of neighboring areas, non-peace community land in kind of this Roxali, Sabaleta area, paramilitaries had done an offensive there, threatened the local people, people had fled the area, paramilitaries kidnapped a youth, and so the peace community in solidarity with those farmers organized a commission to go out there and confront the paramilitaries. And so people kind of converged from a bunch of different directions. People flew into Apartadó from other communities around the world in Colombia and kind of went these different routes. And when we arrived, this is a lot of what we found, kind of just rotting clothes, abandoned houses. There were just a few families that were left, and the peace community and its allies proceeded to seek out the paramilitaries and go look for them. They ended up hiding in the forest, didn't show their face. When we left the area going back towards peace community land, then we heard the gunshots, ba ba ba, and peace community members wrote in their subsequent peace press release saying, yeah, it was this that they were saying, you didn't see us, but we're still here. But that they didn't have kind of the courage to actually face this kind of unarmed coalition and caravan of victims confronting them over the injustices of their actions. And I think here, we get a sense of kind of a different type of peace here. So what's really interesting is when I started asking peace community members about what peace means to them, they tended to define it in two ways. And they would say, well, peace is when we don't collaborate with the armed groups, when we don't participate in the war. And the other thing they would say is peace is when we do collective work and we build solidarity with one another. And what was really interesting was that was different from kind of these theories of peace or ways it's common thought about is when there's no violence, when there's tranquility, or when we have social justice, kind of in a nation-state context, right? It's like, whoa. And second, they were defining peace in terms of their actual principles of their organization, right? Like those are literally their commitments that they have. And so naming themselves as a peace community defined also like how they thought about peace, right? As not only a rejection of war, but also the creation of community and solidarity. And it's really profound because to say that peace is not when the war ends, but when we create something different, I think is a really empowering and powerful idea. Peace is not dependent upon armed actors or kind of the state to do something in particular. It's like communities can create it on their own. And I think that's a really powerful idea that kind of I think about as like a radical peace. That's really kind of getting to the root of the issues here and thinking about real justice forward. That's what we can do immediately. And we just see here kind of also this kind of enactment of creating community and caring for one another, like crossing the rivers and doing this. This was coming back from Rodox Ali to Peace Community land. And then once there, the Peace Community held a gathering of its Campesino University of Resistance, which is a space where different communities, rural communities resisting displacement, come together and they share knowledge about human rights law, land titling strategies, communication projects for documenting their own history. And also in this was a health workshop of medicinal plants where people went out into just right around the village, and different communities pointed out plants that they recognized to have certain medicinal properties or could be used for certain things, and then sharing that with the other communities, right? And then processing these into things that people could take back to their own communities. And one of the peace community members kind of talked about this. He kind of described the Universidad Campesina in this way, kind of using a metaphor of bees, which I thought was really interesting. He says, the university is like honeybees because you always see a bee with flowers where it extracts its nectar. It then takes it to the hive. There they make honey. Honey is medicine. It's everything. It's healthy. I compare these people to honeybees. They bring new and good things so that we learn. And they also take from here to other places. People make creams for pain, powder for bad-smelling feet, and solar energy stations. Those knowledges that are so important. That way of behaving, that fellowship, it is sweet. I compare it with honey. This is different from flies, that all they bring and take is pure dirt contaminating. The university serves as a journey of bees. So I think this is really significant just as a tangible knowledge for these communities, this question of solidarity, but I also find it really, really important when thinking about kind of a racial lens and thinking about kind of an anti-racist project. So, indigenous and black communities, they talk about the war as racism, right? The legacy of colonialism, things like that. The Campesino communities don't tend to use that language. The peace community doesn't. But I think what's really interesting is that we see in the practices here kind of a confrontation of not just kind of this war going on between armed groups in Colombia, but these logics of domination and dehumanization that are tied to colonialism. And that even though the peace community doesn't necessarily think about it from a racial lens, they're participating in this anti-racist movement, right? That doesn't seek to kind of dehumanize certain populations for being less than human, dehumanize their knowledges and their ideas, their production of another world without kind of technocrats or the elite kind of having to lead things. And also the building of this cross-ethnic coalition that includes indigenous communities and campesino communities that may be situated and can be divided amongst one another in this multicultural context where we often see kind of sometimes those ethnic lines can divide people from one another. In this case, people can have their identities and there's a validation of that, but there's also a solidarity that happens. So I kind of see this as kind of this rupture with those relations of colonialism, of dehumanization, divisions amongst social movements and that sort is this anti-colonial rupture as I put it here. So I'll just end and then we'll open up for some conversation. Cite one of the peace community leaders, now deceased, but a really profound, I think, kind of summary of a lot of things we've been talking about here. And this is the words of Eduardo Lanchero, one of the key peace community kind of galvanizers and leaders. He talked about how the logic of the system of death, of the paramilitaries, of the state, is to displace the people. They want to terrorize the people because it generates an individualism so strong that then you don't care about the life of the other anymore, right? So we had to create another way of living, where we were really against the war and against death. That's why the only way was to live in a community. If you live in a community, you have different ways of relating to each other, of organizing, participation, of solidarity, where everyone cares about the life of the other. It doesn't matter how many we are. What matters is that we really know and deeply live a different world. We cannot build this different world tomorrow or in the past or something. We do it now. So I'll leave it there as kind of a encapsulation of kind of what I'm trying to say here, kind of as a bridge between these communities and academic discourse and university, and kind of using these concepts of anti-colonial rupture and radical peace and ecological dignity, kind of like bridge those groups together. So thanks a lot. Open to any questions.
Thank you very much, Chris. I would like to, by way of an invitation to read the book and to engage with Chris's thoughts, I would like to real quick share a thought about my own experience reading the book. I think that the book uses the word present many times in the introduction and in the prologue. And I think the word, I don't know if you know the context in which this word is used, but this word is usually pronounced by communities in commemoration of the life of people who have been murdered and assassinated in Colombia. And the use of that word in the prologue and the introduction, for me, does something very ethnographic and also kind of magical in the work. It seems to me that by using the word present over and over, just after pronouncing the words, the names of Jaime Guzman, Humberto Sepúlveda, Natalia Tuberquia, and Sandra Muñoz, what Chris is doing is actually bridging the gap between the death and what's life, or the dead and those who are alive, and bringing to presence and to the present the lives of those who are no longer with us. So I think that is a very powerful work, politically speaking, also beautiful. It's beautifully written. But I think that what's more important about it, Chris, for me, is that it really brings a very intimate experience and of the presence of those who have been forced to leave. When I was reading it in a cafe near here, I was reading those names, and all of a sudden I thought, like, wow, I am actually accompanied by those the experiences, the intimate experiences of those people who were forced to leave. And that, I think, it also awakens the performative power of ethnography, and it's a very politically relevant work to do. So thank you very much for that, man. It's great. And yeah, let's open it up for some questions, comments, conversations. Yeah.
Thanks, Chris, for the presentation. I think it was very interesting. Like, the maps were really, really good. I'm from Colombia, but even myself, I don't remember all the small villages, and I think that's very good. I would like to know if you could say more about how do you see the relationship between the concept of peace that the community is putting forward and that is proposing versus, or like in relation to the concept of peace that the Colombian government put forward in the 2016 peace agreement, which is territorial peace, paz territorial. So I don't have like a specific question, but I would like to hear more about your thoughts about that. And I have another question, and it's that if you could say more about so sustainability has been like the mainstream framing to make many of the international aid work in Colombia, right? In terms of the governance of natural resources. So you are proposing here like a different concept, which is like ecological justice. So I would like to hear more about how you are like, what is this concept that you are proposing, and that is kind of grounded in this experience in relation to the concept of sustainability, which is the kind of mainstream language that we use. Those are my two questions, and thank you so much for the performance and the presentation of the book.
Thanks. Yeah, we want to maybe take two questions, or maybe we'll just go with that. Anyone else? Yeah.
I'd like to add a question
okay.
to that about ecological dignity. Why not environmental justice, for example, which is also a very common framework to address, among other things, questions of struggles against extractivism and militarism and so on. Why would you go with ecological dignity? What's the edge of ecological dignity versus environmental justice?
Yeah, great questions. I'll actually start with those. I think that kind of what I was trying to do, like the book, I think is on these concepts. There's a combination of kind of these macro concepts that kind of we talk about in the university and kind of analyzing through that, and then others are concepts that come from the community. So, for instance, like my whole racial analysis, that's really informed by kind of debates in the university, and then kind of shaping how I see that community rather than them talking about it in that way. But in terms of dignity, I think I was just really struck by that term and the way people talk about dignidad. And I actually have a kind of a quote in here where one of the peace community members, she talks about what that means, and it's kind of not just dignity in the sense of, well, I'm comfortable with my decisions, but actually that you like build community. And I think why I find that really powerful, and then linking it to ecological dignity, is that like a lot of the crisis we face now is, I feel like the dignity of the earth and of human beings is violated in so many ways. And I think for me a little bit, and I think how I interpret the communities using that term, there's a little deeper sense of that than just talking about sustainability, that just like things can continue to live. I think that thinking about dignity the way they talk about it is an invitation to like really think about the mass violence that's happening, but also like what that alternative looks like. So that's not to say they don't use sustainability or those concepts, but I was really struck by that term. I also think back to kind of justice versus dignity. It's such a great question because the community definitely talks about justice, but I don't know, it's almost as if because justice is so associated with state governance and kind of that realm of politics, talking about dignity is more immediate and what kind of the communities can control. Even though I do think that they enact their own justice through the commemorations, like in spite of whatever the government does or doesn't, they enact their own justice in that way. But there's something about kind of dignity being more of kind of a community-based concept that like really arises there. So I think really productive to think about. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about that as well, because it was just kind of more, an arbitrary choice in some ways, but I think there's kind of an emotive connection sometimes we have to certain contexts for such reasons. And I love these questions because they really bring out kind of some of the like why we did that, because I hadn't like thought through that super intentionally, and so I appreciate that. In terms of peace, yeah, so I think this is really, really interesting, and I think a couple things. So the main way that I saw kind of the Colombian government define, like the Juan Manuel Santos administration and kind of the people close to him defining peace and members of the armed forces, was the guerrillas have to be demobilized, and that there'll be some sort of a social justice to come from that, but that peace, like Santos has said, it's going to happen with the stick or the carrot, and it's going to be pushed through, and that behind all this, there's this economic model, right, of mining and agribusiness, and that part of what the peace process was going to result in was an intensification of that economic model. And I think that's really in contrast to the peace these communities are talking about. And even that concept of territorial peace. So like, those of you who are Colombians know this, right? But like, there's kind of this thing like, in the territories. And so the way that word's used, it's almost like in the regions or like outside of the capital. They use the word territory as if it's like a place over there, but these communities have a way more in-depth concept of what territory is, right? So especially the Black and Indigenous communities that talk about territory as life, a living entity with memory, biodiversity and culture, the space for collectivity and relational being, you know, and sustainability and things like that. So really, you know, for them, like territory, kind of as I've conceptualized here, kind of building upon that, and a lot of Latin American scholars thinking about territories, territory is not limited as like a demarcated space that's controlled by somebody. That's kind of the modern definition we have. But these communities, like, they're not seeking to control and dominate the land and population like a nation state does. They're seeking ecological dignity, sustainability, relations between things. And so I think that helps us see kind of territory, like what is a territory? I think a territory it's a series of places and practices and values that then come together to create a collective subject, right? So we see that with the nation state, the practices of patriotism and borders and elections and all that, that makes us into nationalistic subjects who identify with our nation state. But these communities have a different type of territory, right? Which is about the dignity of all beings, solidarity networks across the communities. And so it's almost like territorial peace. It's not just peace over there. Hopefully we'll have some sort of thing over there, but I think territorial peace from the perspective of these communities is actually much more profound, of different ways of living. So that would be kind of my answer to that. And I think one of the fundamental contradictions and issues of the peace process was the government's vision of advancing extractivism, and these communities saying that is actually violence. That's the continuation of the war in other means. So, yeah. Did I answer any follow-up questions? Other thoughts, comments?
I guess this is more of just wondering about additional context, where you talked about like the sort of international activist solidarity, and then like across these communities that are sort of like geographically close to each other. What's the sort of relationship that those communities have to like maybe other communities, let's say in Colombia or across like Central Latin America or other regions across the world that are also struggling with similar displacement and like armed conflict? Yeah, just curious what those relationships look like.
Yeah, I mean, I just think one of the key things about the peace community is like its participation and like a key actor in creating these solidarity networks, right? So there's the sense of organizations in the U.S. and abroad, right? Europe, elsewhere, Palestine, a lot of those collaborations. And they have this really interesting relationship with a peace community. It doesn't actually go by that, but in Portugal, that's experimenting with like interpersonal love and kind of different things around that, sustainable energies, solar energy, things like that. That's where they've gotten some of their solar panels from. So kind of this collaboration across spaces, and different members of the communities will go to each other's communities and kind of think about, okay, what does it mean to create peace in these different contexts? So a really interesting kind of global network there, as well as with the other communities in Colombia. So this Universidad Campesina, the Campesino University that they have, is comprised of different communities across Colombia, mostly indigenous communities and campesino communities, and then Black communities also participate in certain things. And really what they're united around was kind of a rupture with the governmental judicial system, and kind of rejecting kind of the war, and also their shared kind of rejection of not just the state forces and the paramilitaries, but also the guerrillas. So the left wing and the right kind of rejecting armed struggle or armed action on either side, and coming together. And again, like I say, why I think that's so significant is that in this kind of solidarity network that the peace communities created, it's a multiracial, not even multi-ethnic, because not all the communities that identify as an ethnic group, but it crosses those lines. And I just think that's so important, because in today's world, needing to work together against all these different forms of oppression, like, we need to be able to build solidarity with one another and work together. And another thing that's so interesting about the community is, peace community, is that, like, the community is defined politically. Like, it's not defined about a religious identity or an ethnic identity or a national identity. It's a community of peace. So the people that are in the community, those who are committed and follow those commitments. Now again, it's a campesino community. It's there in that area. Like, we're not community members, right? But I think it's a really powerful idea about, like, the power of political identities, you know, rather than kind of these other kind of more bounded and fixed identities, and the ways that other people can participate in that broader community, even if we're not in that actual organization. But so yeah, really significant in that sense. Yeah.
So, well, Colombia will have elections in a few months. So
Yeah.
I was wondering how you think the dialogue, but also the tensions between this community or these communities of peace and someone like Petro and his program could play out.
Yeah. Great question. I mean, so
Petro and Marquez, of course.
Right. Well, and two, like, one thing kind of that I talk about here in more detail is I kind of interpret the emergence of these peace communities. This is not the only one, of course. There's, like, many across the country, you know, different names in that late 1990s as almost where it was like, look, no more political parties, no more armed struggle, as kind of the exhaustion of those categories, right? This is the moment of the intense paramilitarization of the country, the extermination of leftist parties like the Patriotic Union Party, and also the guerrilla movements as well, kind of communities being frustrated with their levels of violence too. Kind of an exhaustion of just trying to seek change through reforming the state by forming or joining a political party, or trying to reform the state by taking it over through an insurgency. Like, a lot of these, it's just like, that hasn't worked. And so the communities organizing more autonomous modes of politics, right, in that moment. Now, will that moment stay the same forever? Not necessarily. And I think right now is a really interesting moment to think about, like, is the reform of the Colombian state possible with this new movement? I mean, that's an interesting question. I think that the peace community, you know, I think what's important to remember from them is, like, peace and dignity doesn't depend on those changes, but how significant those changes could be for these kind of communities, right? I think that, and without speaking for them, but just kind of all these conversations over all these years with those people, it's kind of, they probably won't trust the government until it actually shows that it's different. But if it does show that it's different, there's really the possibility there for, you know, the combination or kind of complementarity of those movements, right? Especially with respect to just the way that the armed forces operate, the way that judicial cases could proceed. And right, some of that's trying to be done with the peace process and the peace accord and all of that, but the peace community is super disillusioned with that. You know, and like most people are at this point, like the lack of actually leading to sort of any sort of justice in a systematic way. So I think there's possibilities for that, but them having their autonomous position that comes out of that moment of the 90s and them still being really shaped by that, I think one gives them strength because they're not dependent upon any sort of electoral outcome, but could also become a really important base for kind of a broader social transformation. I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts about this too. I mean, many of you closer to this than me, especially with the current political movement.
I don't know if someone asked this already, but have you presented the book in the community? Like this book, have you talked to them about, like, I don't know, like how has the community interacted with the book itself, with the presentations, or I don't know?
Yeah, not yet. It just came out last month, and the Spanish publication just was printed like last week. So this is my first event. I did do an event, the Spanish version, last week at the Feria del Libro in Bogotá. And yeah, in a few weeks I'll be going to the community and presenting them with it. So really excited for that. That's the main audience, you know. I mean, it's an academic book, but and I'm excited to see kind of how they interact with it. When I was doing my fieldwork and I've kind of completed the major portion of it, I kind of wrote out a 1-2 page, you know, summary of my arguments, and you know, talked about it with the community leaders there and some different people. And what I thought was really interesting, it was funny because I had this document and I gave it to the leaders, you know, the Consejo Interno, which is their leadership council. And so they looked at it and, you know, it's had some follow-up conversation. But the paper kind of floated around, and then I noticed that like some other community members actually were looking at it and they were talking about it with them. And it was just interesting when they read it, they're like, oh yeah, like autonomy, you know, this other type of peace is community. Like, yeah, that's right. Like that's what we're doing. And I also have done these performances there too, and that was a really interesting experience too, because I kind of looked at it as like, okay, this is how I'm performing my experience here and some of your experience. I've had different performances that talk about different things. More to see like that, like what do they think about that? Is this appropriate for me to be doing that? Or I don't know, should I change something? Because in an academic space, you know, in these critical ethnography groups I'm a part of, it's like, ooh, I don't know, your use of a prop, or, you know, what about how you say this, and kind of a lot of the aesthetics and kind of the details of it. And for them, they were like, yes, it's so important that these things are being performed in other spaces, that other people are learning about the community through you. And some of them talked about how, yeah, we're doing these, you're doing the performance, and my children are seeing this. They didn't live through the displacement. They didn't live through what happened in La Esperanza. Now they're seeing, and it kind of transformed into kind of a memory event for them. I didn't really mean for that to be the case, but it did. So we'll see how it goes with this. You know, I look forward to seeing, you know, how they think about it, and especially kind of the thing like questions about race and ethnicity and multiculturalism, which I haven't dialogued with them super in depth yet. Kind of my first inquiries into that with them were, yeah, like what about racism? Do you think racism is at play here? And they're like, no, it's a capitalist war of, you know, poor against rich. So it's kind of like, as I kind of like try to have more, we'll see, you know, how that goes, but I'm really looking forward to that. Yeah. So.
The reason what we are so mixed is because there were no laws since the beginning. I'm not Catholic. Since the beginning, most from the Catholic Church, that there were no laws that forbid people to intermarry.
Right.
Find out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I think, oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm going.
Well, I think that really, that is so important because.
That's the difference between United States
right.
and South America
right.
in general.
Yeah, exactly.
Even the Argentinians consider themselves more white, but.
Yes. Well, that's.
They are
yeah.
mixed everywhere.
Yeah.
Because here I couldn't marry my husband until 40 years ago. Or 60
and I couldn't marry her because the Catholic Church prohibited her divorce.
Right, right. Yeah, exactly.
Well,
yeah.
but I say by law in the United States I couldn't be married to him.
Yeah. I really appreciate you bringing that up because. You know what, now is Colombia, Venezuela, like that was Gran Colombia, and what was so significant about that independence revolution was it was defined around kind of racial equality. Marik Salasa's book, Myth of Harmony, and how like the role of pardos, you know, black communities in that moment kind of forced the elites to recognize, okay, this is a multiracial coalition, and this is about everyone being equal. Very different from Haiti, you know, defined as like, the citizen is the black revolutionary, or in the U.S., obviously, like this, it's around whiteness and the exclusion of non-white people, right? Like in the Gran Colombia, it was this, you know,
of course,
this mestizaje, right? Of like,
there are the classes and there's
yeah,
always the
right,
the lighter ones. I would never say the whites.
Exactly. Yeah.
Los claritos.
Yeah.
Los claritos.
And
they were in
yeah.
the top.
Yeah, and so I just feel like in Colombia, right, this kind of like, oh, everyone's the same in terms of like ethnicity, right, like the mestizo.
Yeah.
And the peace community is definitely a product of that because kind of talking to people's life stories and like where they migrated from, and knowing, you know, some other studies about kind of the Christianization and the kind of conversion of indigenous peoples to Catholicism,
That's another.
and cutting kind of some of their learning the indigenous languages. Like by the time these farmers that ended up founding the peace community years later, like they're now mestizos or campesinos or antioqueños, right? They don't identify as indigenous, but they're indigenous descendants. And that mestizaje kind of era, what it does is there's this equality, but then like there's all these hierarchies within it, right? Like there's still kind of unnamed class divergences and stuff. The shift is now it's kind of moved to multiculturalism, where there's this explosion of indigenous, you know, movements and black movements and a lot of communities reasserting those identities because, you know, to gain those rights and taking advantage of governments having rules and laws that benefit them, right? Like you can have a collective territory, you can get access to resources for a cultural education program, things like that. And the downside of that is that's caused some divisions between some of these communities where like, oh, well, we now have a separate identity, right? The downside of mestizaje is everyone's not equal in terms of like your economic power and like the racialization. There's this narrative. Now there's this narrative of everyone's different, and that kind of forecloses some unity. That's why I find, again, back to the question about the Solidarity Network, so important. And why the peace community is so interesting, because they're not playing into this. They're not like, we're really an indigenous community. Give us a collective right that the state will recognize. They're like, we don't need the state to recognize. We want to build with other communities, whatever their identities are, whatever, like across ethnicity, to build this solidarity network. And I think that's super powerful, because it's not falling into the mestizaje that says that race isn't important, but it's also not falling into this multiculturalism where we like foreclose a lot of coalitions and solidarity. So yeah, I thank you for that comment.
I guess just
Yes.
following up on that, I did field work in Apartadon, San Jose Apartadon,
Oh.
in the 90s.
Yes.
And, hi. So, and I know from being there and remembering things people said that the whole kind of respect for other, you know, Afro-Colombian movements and indigenous movement, it's really recent. It's really recent.
Yes.
And I kind of wonder sometimes how deep it is because it's so recent. Because, you know, traditionally the mountains or Antioqueños who are whiter, and they felt pretty good about that, about being the whiter ones. And, you know, Afro-Colombian were more the banana workers or in the flatlands, sometimes in the squatter movements.
Yeah.
So, and the urban movement. So, I don't know, like how deep and sincere do you think the embracing
Yeah.
multiculturalism?
Well, I just think these categories are always strategic moves by certain actors, right? So like they're created by government entities or social movements, and they're strategic. They're always kind of moving around. To say you're a peace community was also at that moment, right? Like being neutral in the war, kind of tied to the Catholic religion, like that had a strategic value that has worked. So these categories are always kind of with strategic reasons, and people who, I mean, I haven't worked in those communities, but, you know, friends, colleagues of mine who have, like they've noted how, a community called itself campesino at a certain moment because that maybe was the way of advancing, and then black community in another moment, or indigenous. So those identities are kind of shifting around and are always strategic decisions, right? And then they have particular implications. Yeah.
Old, and since I was little,
Yeah.
for example, Chocó, there was one plane once a month that went to Chocó. There were no laws, they were abandoned completely for years and years, and nobody thought about them. And for us it was natural analysis. Chocó back there, until there are resources there. That's when the things start changing, and they have to talk about the identity to be living there for centuries.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a question of a lot of these communities, right? Like indigenous communities, black communities, campesino communities, having many of them like a different relationship with land, with other people that like we really need in this moment, you know? But again, that's not an essence of those communities that like, because you're indigenous, like, no, that's a political act that certain communities have taken on. But I do think kind of those rural roots and kind of the seeking sustainability with the earth, like, is super important, right? And so, yeah.
One political thing that's happening now is I hear there's a lot of social leaders that are being assassinated.
Yes.
Is there a national program that is trying to trace these assassins and solve this problem?
Well, there's grassroots organizations, yeah, that track, that are tracking that and
But is there justice?
counting
Are the people that do this being brought to justice?
No, not that there's just mass impunity. So, hundreds of people since the peace accord was signed have been killed every year and documented by organizations like Somos Defensores, Indepaz, like different organizations continuing the work, like the organizations that partnered with the peace community like CINEP and the Justice and Peace Commission, like these kind of human rights organizations have been documenting these things for decades. And again, kind of the exhaustion of these communities, like San Jose Pardo, like the state doesn't do anything about it, so they're going to create peace on their own, amidst very difficult circumstances. This is where, a different type of a government, like, could be really interesting and maybe would be a reversal of that. I don't know. It's hard. Like, we look at other leftist governments in Latin America and like they've doubled down on extractivism, just like Juan Manuel Santos wanted to do with the peace process. So what does that leave for these communities and us kind of as a species and as humans in general, right? So
we have time for one more question. When you were talking about land, I was thinking if you could say more and if you know more about like the land tenure dynamics in the community. Are these plots of land like property of individual households? Or like as part of this ecological dignity, are they envisioning a kind of collective ownership of the land? If you can say more about how they organize that, and if there was like changes, like did they get more land after the peace process? That's something that I should know, but I don't know.
Oh my gosh, really great question. So like when the peace community before it was a peace community, the mass displacement, and then the peace community kind of organized itself and started to go back. So there's kind of a combination of two things. One was like individual land titles that certain individual peoples had, like the original families that settled that area in the 1960s, like they had land titles. And then the community acquired lands from other people who had left and said they were never going to go back. And so they acquired those communally. So they call them las tierritas comunitarias, so like the little community lands. So like private property lands and those. And so through that, everyone in the peace community has access to land. Like everyone they either have their own plot or they can kind of work on somebody else's private plot, or the community will facilitate them having access to land. And one of the requirements of being in the peace community is that you're in a work group and you have, you grow crops and you participate in that economy in some way.
Land access shaped by rights to work the land. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And so now what's happening now is really complicated, because what's happening is that a couple things. One, through the agrarian reform process, like through the peace accord, right, the rural integral reform, some of the other farmers are saying, we want our land back that the peace community has. And the peace community is struggling because they have, like, as they've gone to try to formalize the land, this is what my understanding, as they've tried to kind of formalize their land titles, and they go down to the governmental agency, and there's like all these back taxes that they have to pay for all of these years, and they just don't have, it's like, millions of Colombian pesos, and these people, they don't have the money. And their struggle with those agencies is like, we are victims of the armed conflict. Like, we should not be forced to pay for those money. So there's a lot of tensions around that land where the peace community like has land titles, but it's murky right now of like who is actually going to get those titles to the land. And so again, the peace process like some other people are using that against this peace community and saying, oh no, this was my land. I never sold to them, and the question of documentation and the taxes and all of that. So that's what's playing out there as we speak. Yeah.
I have a question, an announcement to make. So let me go with the announcement first. If any of you want to engage further with Chris's book, you find a QR code on the wall. You can get a 30% discount. Using the code CPEACE30. You scan the code, enter that CPEACE30 code into the publisher's website, and you get 30% discount on the book. Okay, so that's the announcement. And I found so interesting that experience you told us, Chris, about walking to face the paramilitaries sort of hiding out in the forest. And I was wondering, what was the previous moment to that? So, is there any kind of preparation the community does in political, spiritual terms before they go on to do that? I know, for example, from experiences researching indigenous riots, that before they go on to face the militaries, there are days and days of preparation, and it includes political and spiritual rituals and meetings. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
I mean, tons of meetings. I haven't ever perceived something like explicitly spiritual, but definitely before going, kind of commemorating the past and commemorating the dead and commemorating their history. And so definitely that, but just tons of planning meetings, and also kind of harnessing their network. So sending an invitation out through email or phone to all the people that they know, saying, we're going to do this, come join us. And then coordinating all those people arriving there, getting the horses to go, have the food that they would take along. So for there, to go to Roxal, they brought a lot of food, like lentils and things like that, and then bought the few families that were there, bought some things from them in terms of, the pig and plantains, things like that. So kind of a combination of buying stuff from the local people that were still there and then bringing their food, and just all of that coordination. Who's going to go where? So with the accompaniers, right, or the researchers, it's okay, which band are you going to be with? And we'll divide up kind of the non-community members amongst, we'll have these people from this organization walk with this group, and then we'll have these people go this way, just so kind of everyone had kind of a mix of folk. So yeah, really, really intense, and then during the event, constant. I mean, kind of the way you're talking about, ritual, spiritual. There would be a mass, in the evening, and reflecting on it, and the priest who accompanies them, Padre Javier Hidalgo, doing a mass and kind of reflecting on what had happened that day, and doing that. So it's kind of integrated within the whole caravan and pilgrimage. Yeah. Right.
Good.
Well, thanks again. Thanks everyone for being here.